Hello everybody and good afternoon, and a very, very warm welcome to our webinar this afternoon, which focuses on supporting speech and language skills at home. For those of you who've not seen me on screen before, my name is Jo Gallagher and I'm the Paediatric Client Liaison Manager at Irwin Mitchell, based in the Leeds office, but offering support to children and families affected by serious injury across the country. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome on board with us this afternoon my colleague Jo Gallagher, a sister by name, but but that's all. We're not trying to replicate a bad Oasis cover band or anything similar than that this afternoon. Jo is a very experienced speech and language therapist with years of clinical experience in hospitals, in community settings, and also in independent practice. As we go through today, you will have the opportunity to ask questions live throughout the presentation. And if you just wiggle your mouse across your screen, you should have a scroll bar comes up with the Q&A symbol on that. That will be on my screen throughout. So any questions that you would like to ask of myself or Jo, you can publish them on there and I will be able to see them. We won't be taking questions during the presentation, just to give Jo a chance to kind of go through the main content of her presentation, but we will allow time at the end to go through those questions in detail. And if any questions come through which we feel need more time or a more individualised response, we will be getting back to you via email and we will let you know that in due course. So let me just click through. I want just to let you know about where we are in terms of our paediatric webinars at the moment. So some of you may have already logged in and listened to the other webinars that we've delivered as part of our paediatric mini-series. That started back in June, when we looked at managing children's medical and therapy support needs. And Jo is actually going to reflect back on that and give us her experience of delivering speech and language therapy during these very different times. So today we're in the middle of our mini-series, highlighted there in yellow, and we still have two further seminars coming up, looking at physiotherapy on the 26th of August, and then at the beginning of September, a review of education and healthcare plans, because there have been lots of changes that have taken place during the COVID period. We have in fact added one extra webinar into the series, which will also take place on the 26th of August. There we go. That webinar will look at sensory support needs, particularly around supporting children for that really important return to school and all of the complexities that that will involve. And Shelley Williams will be joining us on the 26th of August to run through that, that presentation. A little reminder that all of the recordings from both this webinar today and all of the other webinars in the series are available either via the Irwin Mitchell YouTube channel, or if you would like to have access to the slides, which have additional resources on them as well, you can get hold of those by emailing me directly or emailing somebody at the Irwin Mitchell events team and we will respond to you. I think that's everything in terms of housekeeping. I'm going to hand over now to Jo, who's going to explain to us how we can be supporting our children with their speech and language therapy needs at home during COVID and beyond. Welcome, Jo.
Thank you very much, Carmel. So thank you everybody for joining me this afternoon. I hope that you're going to find the session useful. So just to get going, we're going to briefly just look at the ways that I have had to change the way that I deliver speech and language therapy through the COVID pandemic. And I think I'm just going to do a little sort of highlight and try to put a positive spin on using telehealth appointments, because it was something that I had never done before March. So I've had a very steep learning curve with it, and yeah, lots and lots of positive results from it, to be honest. So I'm going to try and sell that one to you a little bit. And then on the next slide, we'll touch on telehealth. You may have heard things from other therapists about their opinions about telehealth. So what we're going to mainly work on this afternoon is looking at an approach to try and help you support speech and language development at home in everyday activities. And I think what I really want to try and get across to you this afternoon is that trying to work at the right level for your child is the best thing that you could be trying to do at home to support speech and language development, because obviously we're looking at trying to maintain the skills that children have got, and where possible we do want to move them forward, but I'm conscious that different families are reporting different things. They feel as though some families feel as though their children are regressing, some families feel as though their children are sort of staying around the same level, and yeah, some children are making progress, but it's very individual. So I'm just going to try and give you a little bit of practical support with that. And obviously speech and language therapy is very, very broad. There are lots of different specialisms in speech and language therapy. Therapists will be working on very different things. So I thought the best thing to try and do this afternoon would be to present something that I think is very useful for most children who have actually got some speech and language. So we're thinking really around the children that are verbal, but I want to present to you something that I use with almost all of the children that I work with, whatever level they're at. So I'm hoping that you will be able to listen and identify the level that you think your child or a child that you know or are working with. Can you identify one of the levels that I present to you, and then think about how you can maybe be using your speech and language around that level of language, and how you can support a child to move forward. And the other reason why I really like what I'm going to present to you is that personally I think it fits in really well with literacy skills as well. Okay, so next slide. So we won't spend too long on this. Obviously there are different ways that services are being delivered at the moment. I've already said to you that I am using telehealth a lot. I haven't used a lot of telephone consultation, if I'm honest, and thankfully I haven't had too many cancellations or postponements, and I think actually telehealth has facilitated a lack of cancellations or postponements. I think maybe what I want to say about this slide is I am just beginning to move towards going back to face-to-face appointments. It's taken a lot of time to get to that point, and it's appropriate for some clients and not for other clients. And I appreciate that we are still all working at a point where we have to do what feels right for us. And what I wanted to say on this slide was I've prepared some very specific risk assessments in terms of whether a face-to-face appointment is right for a family and a child. And I would be encouraging you to ask your speech and language therapist if you can see their risk assessments, so that you can see the reasoning that they have used in terms of whether or not they decide to offer you a face-to-face appointment. Just ask to see it, make sure that you're happy with it, make sure that it covers all of the things that you care about and that you want to see back in face-to-face appointments, because the therapy, I may have missed something off of mine, your therapist may have missed something off of theirs, because we really are sort of working on our feet at the moment, but do ask to see the risk assessment. Right, so let's move on and just think a little bit, just really briefly. There we are, look, that is my new reality. I'm in my office today. I'm based in Brighouse in West Yorkshire. I don't live very far away, and that is my dining room table. So I've only been back in the office for about a month. I had actually just moved into an office before COVID came along, so it was a little bit of a shock to have to go in to work back at home. But yeah, found myself, there's the camera there that you can see that's linked to my laptop. That's a fantastic little bit of kit, so I can just project. It's a projector basically that fits onto a laptop, so I can project things onto my screen. I can mirror my iPad on my screen. It has actually worked really well. So let's move on and just think. Let's just do some positive things about video consultations. Okay, so advantages. Obviously, we know that you can see your therapist, and the therapist can see your child. It's much easier to show how to do things on telehealth. Therapists, particularly speech and language therapists, we can make the sessions quite interactive. There's been a really big glut of fantastic software that we can access, that means that we can make activities come to life on the screen, we can give control of the screen to children, we can make things move. So it can actually be really good fun, and it has captured the imagination of a lot of children that I've worked with, and I think children are a lot more used to using a screen these days as well, so it has fit really well. I've done lots and lots of joint sessions with other MDT members. So Carmel just mentioned that Shelley Williams is doing that extra OT slot for Erwin Mitchell. She's doing a webinar. Shelley's an occupational therapist that I work with very regularly, and we do joint sessions. They didn't start out very well. We did a lot of interrupting one another and talking over one another when we were making comments to the family or comments to the child, but we've carried on and we've got used to working together, and actually the joint sessions work really well. You're getting 2 therapists for the price of 1. It means that you don't have to book another telehealth session at another point. So it's a great use of time. Sessions can be recorded. So I've literally just sat down this morning and watched back some of the sessions that I've made little snippets of recording for children. And that's been really good in terms of assessing them and double checking the things that I think about. So yeah, a really, really good assessment tool is recording the session. And I think it doesn't have to be a live face-to-face session. It might be too challenging for you. You might feel as though it's too much to try and get your child to sit down and interact with the therapists. And that's absolutely fine. I've done a couple of just sitting down in front of my camera on Zoom and recording something for families. This is how you do it. The child hasn't been there, the parent hasn't been there. It's easier, I think, for me to talk and demonstrate it on screen than write it in a program. So I've just made some videos and then I've sent them to the families to watch, and you can watch it at your leisure then. So you could think about asking your therapist to do that. And I have to say, I've even astounded myself, because some of my clients use communication aids, and I've managed to do sessions with children with communication aids, which I shied away from initially when I had to begin to use telehealth right at the beginning of March. But it's worked. Again, joint sessions. I've done some work with assistive technology people who have worked on children's cases, and we've used a mix of Zoom and a program called Team Viewer, which some of you may be familiar with, which is where you give permission for somebody else to have control of your screen and we've had a split screen. I've been able to see the child and family on Zoom, and we've been able to look at the child's communication aid and see what choices they're making with their eyes if they use eye gaze, and I've been able to see that on TeamViewer. So I think that's fantastic, to be really honest. So again, just you know, something to think about if you haven't thought about working that way before. But there are disadvantages. As we know, there might be a little bit of a delay. You might end up speaking over one another. You do need a good internet connection. I think I've only had one Zoom session where I lost my connection, but if you don't have a good internet connection, it won't work brilliantly for you. It might be hard to have a telehealth call if the household is busy and you've got children running around. And sometimes, particularly with a child with lots of additional needs, I do appreciate the fact that you need another pair of hands, and that can be hard. And with a lot of families, I've suggested that they get some kind of a mount for their phone or their iPad. There are some relatively cheap mounts that I've been buying from Amazon, and if anybody wants anything like that or any links to anything like that, I can certainly give those to Carmel, and we can send you some suggestions of how you can mount things so that your hands are free to just participate in the session and not worry too much about the technical side of things. And I think finally, as a disadvantage, even I, as an experienced therapist, I do find it quite hard to make new relationships and assess children with complex needs over Zoom. It's been much easier with the families that I've already got an established relationship with and children that I know really well, but it is hard with new clients, and I am grateful for the fact that I am gradually going back to face-to-face appointments. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so we said today we were mainly going to focus on looking at promoting speech and language development at home. So I think the first thing is, in terms of, I want you to try and think about what level your child is at and what goal do you want for your child. What are you aiming for them? Are we supporting listening and understanding and processing? Are we trying to encourage your child to use more words? Or are we actually asking them to use longer or more varied sentences? You might be thinking about developing your child's social interaction skills, or you might be thinking about developing how their speech sounds, so their speech sound production. And just a couple of tips on the other side of this slide, particularly in relation to language, is as general rules, and we've got there, think 1 at 1, so 1 word around 1, 12 to 18 months, think about 1 word, and then from 18 months, 24 months onwards, think 2 words at 2, 3 at 3, 4 at 4, etc. And I think it's always really useful to just think about copy and add. People might use different terms for that, but what I mean by that is say back to the child what they've just said and add another word on. So add an additional word, and copying and saying back what the child has just said. You might hear me refer to modelling throughout this presentation. That's what I call modelling. So you are giving your child a good language model back. Okay, right, let's move on. So obviously, you may or may not be working with a speech and language therapist. If you are working with a speech and language therapist, I would just encourage you to think about what I've said today, and then if you're able to, you could try and check in with your speech and language therapist, give them a quick call, ask if you could have a quick session with them, and just check in if you've got ideas about things that if I give you ideas of things that you want to work on with your child, you could double check it with your speech and language therapist, because obviously the advice that I'm giving this afternoon is quite generic. Do you have any recent reports from a speech and language therapist about your child? Can you look at those? What recommendations are in those reports? Have a look back at your child's EHCP plan if they've got one. What comments have we got in there around communication, and do we have any communication outcomes? And what would you really like to work on with your child? Right, so next slide. Let's just have a little think about any barriers to communication. I like to think a lot of these things are obvious, but I think it's really useful to just check in and make sure that you are thinking about these things, because you know they are the easiest things to sort of slip at home. They slip in my sessions sometimes. None of us are perfect, but avoid fatigue. If you're tired, or your child's tired, it's probably not a great time to try and work on something. Do make sure, or try to make sure, that the environment is quiet and calm. I've talked about modelling already. Use turn taking, try and model, say back to your child what they've just said. I've put a question mark there. Do you have to banish siblings? It's a genuine question. Can siblings and family members be involved, especially if we're thinking about turn taking? There'll be times when it is right to have a one-to-one with your child, but there might be times when you can include siblings as well. I've put here, as a rule, avoid apps. That's a personal thing for me as a speech and language therapist. As a rule of thumb, I'm not a brilliant fan of apps, I've got to be honest, and it's not so much about the screen time, although I appreciate that there are issues with spending a lot of time on screen, and that could be a barrier to communication. I just feel as though a lot of the apps are very generic, and they probably aren't really designed to do what your child needs. So unless your speech and language therapist has specifically directed you to an app, I would tend to avoid them. Try to keep activities short and focused. So in my sessions, I tend to have 2, 3, or even 4 very short activities that I want to work on. There might be games or toys. So I sort of think every 10 to 15 minutes, if I'm doing an hour session, I'll change the activity over. I might be actually working on the same speech and language goal the whole way through my session, but I will change I'll change it up. I'll change the reward and use games that are fun for children, things that they want to participate in. We know that with a lot of our children, visuals are very helpful, particularly for children who've got processing difficulties or children who've got auditory memory difficulties. Visuals are fantastic. Use a first and then board, or possibly a longer visual schedule, but they do help. We've talked about making it fun. And yeah, just reward yourself and just celebrate any successes that you get, to be honest. Because we are all working under such challenging times at the moment. Okay, so let's have a little look at this framework that I wanted to introduce to you. You might be familiar with it already, but hopefully you'll find it useful. So I'm going to talk about blank language levels. You may or may not have heard of that. Blank language levels were they came about from a person called Marion Blank. I haven't put references and things in here because I'm aware that I'm very much talking to sort of families and carers, but you can if you Google blank language levels, you will find lots of information out there on the internet about them, so you can find out more if you're interested. But as I've said, without repeating what we said on a previous slide, they're great. I'm using them with most of my children, and what I like about these are, I think you can hopefully after this afternoon you can work out what level your child's at, and then you can just work it into everyday activities. So let's move on and let's have a look at level 1. Okay, so blank language level 1 is very much talking about the here and now. So we would use questions and language very similar to what's up there on the slide. Find the, point to the, where is the, okay, what's this? Let's name objects. It's very much about sort of, like we've said, from about 18 months onwards, and I've put there up until about 3 years of age. It's that very rapid level where a child is learning lots and lots of words, or hopefully the children are using lots and lots of words. I think the important thing to say about this level is that it is very much, we talk about what we can see, we talk about what is in front of us. So obviously we might be looking at pictures in books, or we might be talking about toys that we're playing with. You might hear speech therapists, I know myself, talk sometimes about a child being at a very concrete level of language. The concrete relates to the fact that we're talking about what's in front of us. It's talking about the here and now. So let's just see if we can maybe put that into a practical example. I was trying to think of one. Washing hands, that's on everybody's agenda at the moment. We're all doing lots and lots of hand hygiene. So if you were talking to your child at this language level, and you were washing hands, you might be saying things like, where is your hand? Where are your fingers? Show me your thumb. Where is your nail? Okay, so all things that are there in front of the child during that hand washing activity. Let's name the sink, let's name the tap, let's name the towel. Okay, so level 1, really important, because this is when language emerges. This is when we begin to get words. We get lots and lots of words at this level, and we're learning labels for things. So it's a really important stage. We'll move on to level 2 and just think about how things progress. I think it's important to say that obviously that the levels are a hierarchy. So obviously we get level 1, 2, 3 and 4. You will find that your child will probably be working within a level and hopefully become quite established at that level, and then skills might begin to emerge. So your child might be mainly working at level 1, but you begin to see some of these things at level 2, and you will get overlap between levels. And you don't ever leave a level behind. We're always learning new words. We've learned new words through COVID, haven't we? I don't think many of us knew what furlough was before. So, you know, I'd like to think my language levels are quite high, but I did a level 1 because I learned a new word, etc. So you will get overlap between the levels. So at level 2, we're still very much talking about the here and now. So it is very concrete. We're still talking about things that are directly in front of us, things that we can touch, but we might be honing in a little bit on specific details about things. So we might be learning about size and number. We might be learning about colour. And this level is really key. I've been reflecting whilst I've been putting this presentation together that this is an important level, because this is the level where I think children sometimes get stuck. I can reflect on lots of children that I'm supporting in primary school, and they do find this level hard, because we're moving beyond just knowing that a word is a label. Like in level 1, we said a word is a label, but at level 2 we're learning the things about, well, what does that label really mean, and how does that label relate to other words? So with a word we have the label, but then we might know what sounds that word begins with. We might be able to think of another word that rhymes with the word that we're saying. We might know what category it's in. We might be able to think of a word that's opposite to that word. And I think that's reflected in what I've got down there on that slide. What's the function of the word? What do we do with it? What do we use it for? Can we finish a sentence? You dig the garden with the. what other things go with that word? Okay, again, we've got down there about categorizing and sorting things. So you can see here how we're moving beyond that one word and labels, and we're beginning to put phrases and sentences together, and we're beginning to do some quite basic explanations. And some of the WH questions that you might have heard therapists refer to comes in here. Who words, what words, and where words. They're all really important. And I've put a little note down here to say to myself that you might be working at this level for quite a long time with a child. There's actually a lot on that slide that we need to learn about words. So I'm reflecting on some of my children and their EHCP outcomes, and we might be working at this level for a year, a couple of years, because I can think of lots of different EHCP outcomes that I could pull off this slide and put in as goals for my children. And it's fine to work at a level for a long time, because you're building a really firm foundation there for speech and language development. So don't worry about racing through these levels too quickly. It's really important to get it right, and the firmer that a child's language level is at one level, the easier it is going to be for them to move on to the next. Okay, so again, let's go back to that hand washing example there. Okay, so we at level 1 we were naming things, but we might talk about some functions. Yeah, so we named the towel before, we knew it was a towel. Now we might talk about what a towel does, that we get dry with a towel, that we turn the tap on, and that we wash our hands with soap. Okay, I hope that makes sense, that you can just expand your language a little bit there. What would we use something for? Why do what do we use soap for? We use soap to clean our hands, but you're moving on and expanding things there. Okay, let's have a think about level 3. So things are getting trickier and trickier as we move along. So we get to level 3, and you can see there that by the time children get to level 3, they really are beginning to get the idea of words and language, putting words into sentences and phrases. This is quite a milestone, level 3, and again, another one that I would suggest you might want to work at quite a long time with a child, because what happens at level 3 is that we begin to move beyond those very concrete things that I've talked about. So at level 3, we begin to talk about things that are not in our immediate environment. So that abstract word comes in. Language becomes a little bit more abstract. So you might be able to follow a set of instructions, do X, then do Y, then do Z. You might be able to tell a story or give a description of an event or an activity. You might be able to summarize, not necessarily in a sentence. Brilliant if you can do it in one sentence, but can you tell me about that story? What happened? Can your child do a summary of what happened in something? Are they able to begin to predict what might happen? Can they tell you what somebody did in a story or in an activity that they did? What did somebody say? And ideas about feelings begin to come in here. And another important thing is just being able to define a word. They've already begun to learn some of the skills for that at level 2, but at level 3, child should be able to tell you what a word means. That has to be a word that's familiar to your child, a word that they already know, a word that they're familiar with and that they've used. But yeah, they should be able to explain to you, for example, what is a tap, what is a towel, what is soap. Can they define those words? And those skills have usually developed around 4.5 years of age, but it certainly is it's a challenge for some of the children that I work with. Level 3 is a challenge, and I think it's important to think about these these language levels in terms of children. I'm thinking about behaviour here, to be honest. So maybe somebody gets into trouble for doing something. Can they give an explanation about what happened? Can they tell you what's happened? It's probably really frustrating if the language levels are not at level 3 or not very secure at level 3. Explaining to you what happened is really, really tricky. So think very carefully, and it might be that you might need to go back to level 2 type questions to get the best out of your child's explanations and to avoid battles. Okay, so let's move on to level 4. So moving on from level 3, at level 4, language does become very complex and very abstract. I'm going to jump right to the end of this slide here, because I've said that these skills have usually developed by 6 years of age, but skills continue to consolidate at this level and extend. And I think it's important to say, jumping right beyond 6 years, that we know that our brains are not fully developed until we're 25 years old. And I've reflected on this slide and thought, yeah, I can see a lot in this slide that you might even find in a GCSE question. So level 4 is a level that we're always working at and working at for an incredibly long time. Those skills are, you know, they've begun to emerge by 6 years of age, but this is the level that children at the top end of primary school and the whole way through high school are working at this language level, and it's a very challenging language level for a lot of the children that I work with, and I suspect a lot of you will be looking at this slide and be thinking that this is a very challenging language level for your child as well. So there's lots of, you know, making sense of things here. Did we really understand what happened? Have we got a superficial understanding of something that's happened, or can we give a really good explanation of what happened? Why did it happen? Why can't we do things? Can we problem solve? Can we look at things from other people's perspectives? Can we make inferences? So you can see here there are lots of social demands on the child as well. And I think a very important one, again, going back to behaviour and talking about behaviour situations, all why questions fall into level 4. Why questions are really hard. So this is all very abstract. And I'm thinking about a young lady that I'm working with who is at the top end of primary. But her language, if we're going to put a developmental level on her speech and language skills, I would say that they were around a 3 to 4 year level. I think it's quite confusing for schools, to be really fair to them, because at 3 to 4 years, she's actually got a lot of language. She says a lot, she puts sentences together, and she uses quite a lot of different words. So I think school perceive that her speech and language skills are quite good, and I think they sometimes wonder why I'm going in there, because I think they think she doesn't really need speech and language therapy. But this level 3 and level 4 are where, you know, it really challenges her understanding. School get really cross with her because she can't always explain what's happened if she's had a behaviour outburst. And I'm working really hard with school to try and get them to understand that, you know, these level 3 and level 4 type questions are really hard for her, and we need to be moving back and using those earlier language levels with her to get the best from her. So I hope that that makes sense, and I hope that you've maybe been able to identify the level that you think your child might fall within. And at the end, before we take questions, I've popped a slide together with you where I've put you a link to some resources, where you'll be able to find some resources and download them, and they will help you maybe work within one of these particular levels. So I think, Carmel, you gave us a sneaky peek then of that speech sound slide. So shall we move on to that now? Thank you. Okay, so I know that you won't all be just concerned about language, although for me, you know, language is really, really important. Some of you might be worried about the way that your child's speech sounds as well. So, and I think this is challenging. Working on speech sounds can be challenging for speech and language therapists as well. So working on that at home with your child can be difficult. I'd say really focusing on listening. Get your child to listen for the sound that you're saying, because listening is one of the foundation skills in actually being able to say the speech sound. And then the hierarchy that most speech and language therapists would work on in terms of getting a speech sound firmly embedded within a child's speech sound system would be to be able to say that sound by itself, and then say it in a short word. So that might be like a consonant vowel or consonant vowel consonant word, but a very short word. Once they've got that, then move it into longer words, and then put it into short phrases, then into sentences, and then you can move into more spontaneous speech. And something that a lot of my families get tripped up would be, say for example, we are working on the sound S, so they're working on the S sound. Lots of mums will say to me, oh yes, she's really getting it, but she can't say stop, or she can't say slide. And I would call two consonants together a consonant cluster. And even though the child that I'm working with might be establishing that sound, I wouldn't expect them to be able to put it into a cluster. So just look out for those, especially if you're working at home and you may be sourcing things off the internet. Look out for those double consonants at the beginnings of words, and don't put them into the sort of speech sounds that you're trying to work on with your child, because it's actually a different level of speech sound production in it, and it's a bit challenging. And I've just put you a little diagram on the other side there. So I think one of the things that I did want to say to you was that lots and lots of NHS speech and language therapy departments have got great websites these days with lots of toolkits on for all different types of speech and language difficulties. I've taken this one from Leeds Community Health, the Leeds Community Health Toolkit, just because I used to work in Leeds, and I know that they've got a fantastic toolkit on their website. But there you'll be able to see the different ages and stages that speech sounds develop at, because again, it's a little bit like with the levels of language. You don't want to go in at the wrong level and work on a speech sound that is not appropriate for the age that your child is at. So obviously, if your child is 3 and that they can't say a R sound, you'll be able to see from that chart that we wouldn't expect that to develop until after 5 years. So I think that there's some really nice information out there, and you can just double check it yourself before you embark on doing something. Okay, right, thank you, Carmel. Just move on. All right, so we've talked about avoiding battles. I think hopefully I've shown you that if you use the blank level approach, your child doesn't really even need to know that it's a speech and language activity. In your mind, you have picked out one of the things from a language level that you've decided to work on, but your child doesn't need to do that, especially if you're doing it in an everyday activity. We've talked about modelling. You know, you don't have to get into, well, it's hard to avoid battles, but you know, just show your child how to do it. Don't ask them to do it, show them how to do it, ask them to copy you. And it's fine to use lots and lots of repetition. Going back to familiar activities to begin with will help your child's confidence, and then you can just gradually extend things, but repetition and familiarity is fine. And I use lots and lots of that in my sessions. Children don't get so anxious when they know what they're working on or what's expected from them. And if you want a big barrier to learning, then anxiety is definitely one of those things. If you're feeling anxious or worried, it's very hard to listen and take things in. So you know, try not to get there. And I've put a couple of ideas here. So I've put down, this would be more for if your child was aware of the fact that you were doing a speech and language activity together. So if it's a speech sound, for example, they might be a bit more aware that you're actually trying to work on a sound that's hard for them. Try what I call the one and done approach. So we do one and then it's done for today. And you can do one and done every day. It's better than not doing anything at all that day. And I think I've got some visuals somewhere for the one and done, sort of a visual that you could have on the fridge. And again, if you would like a copy of that, if you ask Carmel, I can send that to her. And I've put you a link here. So I know that this says September 2018. It's just a visual, but again, this would be something more for you to make as a parent. But basically, you take a month and you choose, and that's very hard to read, but if you follow the link, you'll be able to read them and you'll be able to download some. I've downloaded some and I've got some templates for calendars as well, if anybody would like those. But you just choose a task to do every day. And, you know, you'll get an awful lot done in a month if you think of it like that, rather than thinking that you've got to do lots and lots of speech and language therapy activities every day that effectively don't end up fitting into everyday life. So hope that that's a useful link for you to go and have a look at. And then I think on the last slide, Carmel, we've just got some links to other things. Okay, yeah. So I've mentioned about checking in on NHS speech and language therapy websites. And I've put you some links to some other websites that, well, I use them quite regularly, and you'll either find that the resources are free, or if there is a charge for them, they are very reasonable, as in £1 or £2 for an activity. So we've got Teachers Pay Teachers, which is, it's an American website. You need to be wary of that. Unfortunately, loads and loads of resources come from America and we have to modify them. But you can put a filter on there. So you can put a filter for an age level, and I would choose the developmental age level for a child. You can put a filter on for free activities, and you could put a filter on for example, if you were working on functions of words at level 2, you'll be able to put a functions filter in, and it will bring up a list of resources that you could download for free. So you know, it's a good starting point. Carrie Hughes is a speech and language therapist. She's based in the UK. You do have to pay for her resources, but they are very reasonable and they are English, which is fantastic because, like I've said, most stuff is American. So if you go on Carrie's website, she's got 2 separate pages. She's got a shop, and in her shop she's got more speech and language resources, and she's got some speech sound resources. So you should be able to find something that you're looking for on there. I've just thrown this third link in, the communication matrix. I'm aware that I've been talking very much about children who have got some language. Your child might be non-verbal or at a very, very basic language level, and the communication matrix is a really nice website where you can go on and you can map where your child is at from very early speech and language development, and you can profile their skills. It will give you ideas of what to work on with your child, and then you can go back in and you can reprofile them and you can measure progress. And another progress checker underneath there is the ICANN website. So ICANN is a website that has got some excellent speech and language resources on there. And again, underneath that, the Communication Trust. So ICANN and the Communication Trust, they are websites that you can trust. They are websites that speech and language therapists will go to look for advice or activities. Okay, and I just put you a link to the Leeds Community NHS SLT Departments Toolkit that I've talked about, and that's where I pulled that speech sound poster from. And one last website that I would direct you to, which isn't on there, a speech and language therapist called Lindsay Allen. So that's Lindsay with an L-Y-N-D-S-E-Y, and it's Allen with an E at the end. She's got a website, Think Talk Learn, and she's got a YouTube channel. You can subscribe to that YouTube channel. She's got some really nice videos on there that will give you some video examples of the types of things that we've talked about today, and you'll be able to see her working with her own daughter, and she works on lots of narrative and storytelling. Some really nice examples for you to watch if you wanted to try out any of the things with your child. So thank you for listening to me. Carmel,
yes, hopefully you can hear me, Jo.
I can, yes.
Thank you so much. I have to say the Q&A and the chat forums have been a hive of activity whilst you've been talking. So you've clearly kind of rung some bells for parents and carers out there in terms of their concerns and in terms of the things that they've been thinking about over the last few months. I think I want to just kind of reflect back on something that you said right at the beginning of your presentation, and that was around asking for copies of risk assessments.
Yes.
I think very often as parents and carers, we can be reluctant to ask for information because we don't want to be seen as being difficult or pushy, or to kind of get any kind of negative reputation.
Yes.
But because of the situation that we've been in with COVID, and of course every family's experience of that has been very unique as well, it's really important that we as parents and carers and our children feel comfortable re-entering that therapy setting. So I thought that was particularly important and something that I will certainly go back to families with.
And I guess I agree. I agree completely. It is hard to ask for things, but it's so important at the moment to do that. You know, everybody needs to keep themselves safe. As a therapist, I need to keep myself safe, and I want all my families and my children to keep themselves safe. And you see, I've got some of my clients where I've done a risk assessment on them, and I've decided that I don't want them to come to clinic. And again, if you ask for my risk assessment, you will see my reasoning as to why I don't think it's a good idea that you come to the clinic at the moment. So there are lots of different levels to asking to look at that. But I just think it's really important that you ask, and I think it's really important that as therapists we are thinking it through really carefully. Yeah. And I can see myself using telehealth for quite a long time to come. I think I'll have a mix, to be honest. But yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, and I think that reflects back on some of the previous webinars that we've done as part of this series. Actually, you know, the initial research findings that have been carried out on the use of technologies for therapy for younger people have been overwhelmingly positive. I think, you know, people who are perhaps the wrong side of 40, like myself, are a little bit more tech phobic than the younger generation, who have really engaged in a new and a different way of accessing therapy for themselves. Yeah. One of the other things that I just wanted to come back to, and this is thinking ahead to the webinar that we've got coming up in September, where we look at EHCPs again, and that was highlighting that mismatch between language which is used and language which is understood.
Absolutely. And I suspect and I hope that I've just maybe lit some light bulbs with some families today, because it's so important that we are working at the right level for the child. And I think I gave you the example of the school where I think they think I shouldn't really be going, that she doesn't really need me, and oh boy, she really does need me. But the school don't understand those different levels, and I find it quite concerning sometimes. Yeah. That, you know, the level of language that that children are being exposed to in the classroom, and they're not going to learn if you're not directing your language and your literacy at that right level. They won't learn, and learning is enough of a challenge for our children as it is. So yeah, and that's why I like this model, because I think it's a well-used model within speech therapy, but I think it translates into everyday life very well, and I think it's pretty easy to understand. And I know that some of the families will get it. I say it's easy to understand. Some of the schools don't always get it. But you know, you've got some really hard evidence for saying, well, look, they can't work at this level, so why are you asking questions at level 3 or level 4?
Yeah,
and you've got to keep asking those questions, and you've got to keep going back and challenging. I'm quite passionate about it, actually, as you can tell.
No, it's great to see that passion coming through, Jo. We have had a technical question come through, and this might be something that you want to address outside of the presentation, and that was thinking about using the language for thinking tool as an alternative to the blanks levels.
And it's not an alternative. Yes, use it. It is based on the blank language levels. Language for thinking is very much based within this, and it's a fantastic resource.
Okay, brilliant. That's answered that one. And another question that's come through is looking for some advice about a child who is fixated on particular words. How do you move them on from that?
Yeah, and that's a tricky one, isn't it? I'm trying to think. I'm imagining that maybe the child is very repetitive with those words, or sort of echoes those words a lot. So it is a challenge to move children on from that. I would have a think about, well, again, lots of modelling, and think about the approach that I mentioned right at the beginning, is where we add another word on, if that makes sense. So we're adding a word to it and giving them a broader model. But yes, it is. It's tricky, definitely. But yeah, and again, I think just like, you know, exposing to lots of different language, and I think if a child's really fixated on a word, as a speech and language therapist, it might make me question whether or not there's some underlying issues with understanding at that level, because children can be quite repetitive or use what they know and what they rely on. So do we need to look at expanding their understanding of other words before we can expect them to then begin to use those words? Okay,
great advice there, Jo. One more question well, two actually that have come through. One I think is more of a comment than a question, and that was from a parent who said that their child was due to have a PEG surgery before COVID. Unfortunately, that hasn't been able to happen. There's no date yet in the diary, and so that child is still being fed with an NG tube. And I guess they're just sort of throwing their hands up with a bit of frustration about that. Do you have anything to say or any advice regarding feeding systems and how we might move forward with that?
And each child's feeding will be individual. So for some children who are awaiting if you're awaiting a PEG, have they got an NG tube in place? Can they have anything orally at all? Obviously, if the advice from speech and language therapy is to not have anything orally, then I wouldn't advise giving them anything. You could ask your speech and language therapist if there's any sensory things that you can be doing alongside tube feeding to calm the child and maybe work on some oral motor skills, but you would have to check in with your own speech therapist about that. If you're doing a little bit of NG feeding and a little bit of oral feeding, and that's being cleared by your speech and language therapist, I think, do you know, my biggest advice, and I know it's hard, and it's hard, I can say it as a speech therapist, as a parent, I know it's very hard, but there can be a lot of anxiety around meal times. And like I said, I said anxiety is a barrier to learning, which it definitely is. And anxiety can sort of up adrenaline levels, and then that can have a knock-on effect on appetite as well. My big thing around there would be to try and, you know, go away and scream where they can't hear, but try not to let your child see that it's causing you and potentially them anxiety. It's feeding is such an emotive subject. Absolutely.
I'm conscious that we are at 3 o'clock, but there are 2 questions that have just come in towards the end there that I would like to quickly go through. So it may be that we have to do a short answer and then we'll get back to those individuals with a more detailed response afterwards. The first one is, what are the benefits of Lego therapy?
Okay, yeah, again, fantastic, brilliant for social interaction, brilliant for sort of working at level 2, level 3, putting sentences together and giving instructions. It's a fantastic activity.
Okay, good. And the next one, I'm hoping that I can pronounce this correctly. If a child is using Proloquo to go, wants to use his own voice, can we start teaching him speech sounds instead of just teaching him language?
Potentially, yes. I think it might depend what level the child's at and whether they've got any vocalizations and what their oral motor movements are like. But maybe if the person who asked that question wants to send us any more information, I'd be happy to have a look at that and give a more detailed response.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jo. Thank you for all of it this afternoon, and thank you to everybody for their comments and questions throughout. It's really been a lively discussion today, and something that I'm sure we will return to in the weeks and months ahead. A quick reminder that we've got lots and lots of information on the Irwin Mitchell website. There is a screenshot on your screens now, which will tell you about upcoming events and webinars that we have planned. And you've also got the opportunity on that site to give your suggestions of things that you would like us to cover. It doesn't have to have a COVID theme or a paediatric theme, things that you would like to see us present on in the future. We'd love to hear from you. So the next webinar in the mini series is going to be taking place on the 26th of August. And we look forward to seeing many of you there. Thank you very much for listening. Take care and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.